We will now begin our discussion on distributed energy resources. Chair calls Pat Wood, Suzanne Burton, Amy Hart. Please state your name, who you represent, and proceed with your testimony.
Good afternoon, Chairman Phelan, members of the legislature. I'm Pat Wood. I've been invited here to testify today in my role as an advisory board member of the Conservative Texans for Energy and Innovation. I'm also president of the Hunt BEE Network and Energy Storage Company and a board member of Quanta Services construction firm and solar manufacturer and installer SunPower. But I guess I'm more known for what happened 25 years ago this week. For me, I was doing the math coming over here in the car this morning, and sitting in the bush in the office of then elected Governor Bush, who was interviewing me for a open position at the Public Utility Commission, and I remember him distinctly saying to me that utilities care more about what we think, and he pointed to himself in the Senate and the House up there in the office, and than what their customers think. And that's wrong, and we're going to change that. So my charge from that point was to get us to a market. I had a great pair of colleagues on the commission, wonderful staff to do that. We got a legislative mandate right off the bat in 1995 to open the wholesale power market to competition, i.e. to let the power generators compete, not talking about the retail customers yet. And that mandate, we set up the ERCOT ISO at that time, got the utilities together to facilitate that, to facilitate wholesale power transactions, to streamline the interconnection process for power plants. It used to be a multi-year process. To hear bills say now it's 19 to 23 months. It's the only place in the country where it works that well. And then, of course, our role in the commission was to drive utilities to seek the most cost-effective power for their customers. That worked out beautifully over the years. So similarly, 4 years after that, in 1999, in Senate Bill 7, the legislature opened up the power sales sector to competitive entry from non-utilities. The munis and the co-ops were given the option to open their franchises on their own schedules. And coming from Mr. Deschatel's home district in Port Arthur, and not down too far from yours, Chairman Phelan, the parts of Texas that were outside of ERCOT were delayed because at that time the wholesale power market, the ERCOT equivalents that supported those parts of Texas as well in the Panhandle and also in far west Texas and El Paso, were not mature, or they were non-existent. One of my first responsibilities when I moved with Bush to the federal level and headed the FERC was to get the power markets opened up in all those other areas. I didn't get El Paso done, but the other parts we did. And the Southwest Power Pool and the Mid-Continent ISO today are fully mature markets on par with, slightly behind, I should say, ERCOT, but certainly can support that market that we didn't have in 99. So not what I'm here to testify on today, but I do think it's long overdue for all of Texans to have the benefits of competitive retail power that the people inside ERCOT do. So happy to help out on that issue whenever the time comes. But back in 99, almost all of our power was generated by gas and coal, with significant contributions from the two large nuclear stations that Bill referenced earlier. Our average regulated rate, as you'll see on my little, I have 5 little slides attached to my document I gave you. The first slide there was the rate that I would have paid had I lived in Houston in 2001 on the eve of competition. That 10.5-cent rate broke out about 7 cents being for the generation, the power generation component, and then the remainder being distribution, transmission, and then the government charges and the like, adding up to about 10.5 cents. That market opening that we did that was effective on 1/1/2002, and the complete ring fencing of the regulated wires utility business from the competitive generation business led to over a decade of significant investment in ERCOT First in generation. Starting in 1999, a large number of new gas-fired plants sprung up across Texas, and wind power, which was a new technology that we had none of. We had one actually out in that LCRA built back in '99. That came on the scene as well. The combination of the streamlined siting process that we adopted here, the standardized transmission pricing and interconnection process, friendly utilities, a large open customer base, and a very supportive regulatory and legislative environment all contributed to this very positive investment image for Texas. Legislation in '05, long after I left, and Senate Bill 20 set in motion a statewide planning process for the power grid, which led to the CREZ, the Competitive Renewable Energy Zone, the largest transmission investment in U.S. history. This strengthened our western and central power grids in ERCOT to accommodate the attachment of a very large amount of wind-powered and now more recently solar-powered generation to the market. In addition, the market forces led to the retirement of a number of coal and natural gas-fired plants. This underscores for me one of the most significant features of what we did here, which was to move the risk of power generation investments from the back of captive retail customers to the market, to companies and investors who can best manage that risk. And at a customer level, the prices have dropped markedly from their regulated 2001 levels. That next slide, slide 2, as you'll see there, this is my personal my rate in Houston. I think in Dallas actually it could be a little bit lower because their wires charges are a little bit lower. They don't have hurricanes up there to pay for. But the savings there, as you'll see in the light blue sector, are about 3 cents out of that. So the 10.5 cents dropped to 7 cents. And I get asked around, and so that I think you'll hear from my retailer that allows me to see those wholesale prices as your last witness today, so you can ask him about that. But if you adjust inflation into that number, that's over a 50% drop. So when I discuss that Texas experience around the world, I basically go over what I show on slide 3. Where did the buckets of savings come from? And there are multiple ones, but the big 3 are these. It's a lot more efficient. You get a lot more efficient power plant operations. When you don't have a regulated rate base, you can just pass the cost through if you mess up. If you mess up, you got to eat the cost. So you run them differently. You think about dispatching them differently, and you run them more efficiently. That's kind of intuitive, and that's true in a wholesale market as well as a retail market. Lower profit margins. Until 2 years ago, was chair of the independent power producer company Dynegy. We were actually the largest independent power producer before we merged with Vistra up in Dallas early last year. But the low profit margins that we got compared to what as a regulator used to give, it made me feel guilt at night that the rates of return we would build into the utility rates, God bless them, they did good with it, but we can get by with a lot less. And that lower profit margin, which is what comes out of a competitive market, is what happens when you have all the resources competing. In addition, you had the supply stack with 26,000 megawatts of wind up to now, and I think what Bill said, more to come. Those have no variable cost. So in an energy market, you're bidding out everything at basically variable cost, plus maybe a little bit, but not a whole lot of margin built into that. So your clearing price is really at a very low level when you're flooding in from the zero cost side of the stack. About half of the stack on the typical day in Texas being wind and solar, which has zero variable cost. Of course, the impact at the retail level is you've got 50 retailers competing, jockeying to get your business. Whether you're a residential customer or school, military base, a big box retailer, or large industrial, they're all in the market. So that very heterogeneous market really creates a lot of opportunity for competition, and competition always erodes profit margins. A big bucket is that third bullet on slide 3, is that the excess cost of capacity is borne in Texas in the ERCOT market by the market participants. It's even in competitive markets outside of here, which I did regulate at FERC, those other markets do have something called a capacity market or capacity construct, an additional auctioned off item that puts the cost of the hardware on the back of customers. as part of a competitive market. Not to mention, of course, the continued to be regulated markets, some of which we still have here in Texas. The excess cost of capacity, that extra, in the case of what Bill and Shelley were talking about, 8%, 10%, 13%. In Pennsylvania, it's 28%. That extra cost is on the back of customers in some regard. And here it's not at all. That shift of that to the customers, again, is one of our big savings and one of our big virtues. I put in parentheses the investment because savings did come from 3 buckets, but we also had costs go up. So as you'll see in my rate comparison, the wires charge moved from about 3 cents to about 4 cents for me in Houston, and a pretty typical trajectory and elsewhere in Texas, because we did spend a significant amount of money to beef up the infrastructure. Again, that was the largest transmission project in U.S. history. We are one of the few regions experiencing growth. Bill and Shelley both said that earlier. That rising power demand has now come more closely into balance as the inefficient power plants have shut down. But as I noted above, that excess is borne by the markets. In most hours of the year, the excess power that we have flooding the market here leads to very low prices. At some peak hours this summer, though, we did see it rise to the level as was discussed earlier, and on a couple hours all the way to the $9,000 price cap. That's $9 a kilowatt hour, pretty expensive. But that opportunity for some profitable hours is what has given the incentive to investment going forward. What kind of investment? It's changing. We had the last capacity debate 5 or 6 years ago here in Texas, and the response at that point, driven by cost, was really led by gas-fired plants and some wind farms that were built outside the Panhandle to diversify the wind portfolio. This year, as you heard, it's a big story about solar, a new entrant, storage, and of course wind again. And I think to answer, I believe it was Mr. Rodriguez's question, it's been an interesting trajectory to watch in my career. You've had wind kind of start high, then really through the early 2000s, just plummet down to where it's really cheaper than any other fuel to make electricity. Solar lagged at about 5 years. In 2011 or so, just massive competition, particularly from China, required the manufacturers of solar to really cut the price and get much more efficient or go out of business. So that has come down like a ski slope as well. And just in the last 18 months, you've seen lithium-ion storage batteries, which I'm involved in for my day job, come down just to where you're actually able to talk about it at a hearing like this. We wouldn't have had this in the last interim. There was not even a reasonable price point for storage, and now it's so right there. And it's, I'm sure, even we're not halfway down the ski slope yet. So that's kind of a exciting thing about the future there. These new investments will join the existing fleet. Obviously, we are blessed here with all of the above portfolio, and it's a rich, diverse portfolio that will maintain our low-cost and reliable power system. As a final point, the best thing that we never had was demand response, and it's here. It's here now at the retail level. It's always been at the industrial level, but it's now pervasive across the whole state. The ability of customers to respond, or I should say more accurately, the ability of their iPhones to talk to their smart appliances and really respond to the price signals in real time and help manage the market is something as a regulator I dreamed about, but I wasn't smart enough to dream about what it should actually play out and look like, much less dream about a smartphone. Who ever thought about that in 1999? But in that era, we didn't have this silver bullet. And now the ability of supply to actually respond in real time to demand, demand to respond to supply prices in real time, makes those days of that big peak in the afternoon not quite history, but I'm looking at it. I mean, I see a much more rational grid coming in place where you'll be charging cars at night and you'll be having demand response manage that afternoon peak because people don't want to pay $9 a kilowatt hour for electricity. They want to manage it down. People can continue to pay that if they like, but nonetheless, that is an important change in technology and customer preference that happened much swifter than I think anything has happened in our professional lives. And I think that the open power system in Texas is fertile ground for even more of that kind of innovation to lead the nation. So how do we keep Texas that magnet for innovation? I do have a final slide, or slide 4, that, I'll mention this one here, Power 2100. Probably long before 2100, I think this will be the end game, at least the end game for this century. I'm not the best gypsy around here looking at a crystal ball, but I would say certainly modular nuclear. We've got nuclear's way overpriced now, but it has the capability to get down into being reasonable. Wind and solar continuing their stampede into the markets. Storage down there in the bottom. Electrified transportation taking up a lot of our nighttime load to really levelize that power grid. And then this last point I just mentioned a moment ago about real-time demand response. Those things are really what our power grid is moving toward. And Texas, because of the open system and really the creativity that a lot of people are bringing here because they're allowed to, will continue to make that a place where we're going to be the lead here. So how do we do that? Obviously, tying back to my first day here 25 years ago, continuing from your mouths as the leaders here and from the commission to re-emphasize the importance of the customer. It's a customer-focused revolution that happened here, and it has to continue to be. We must continue to ring-fence the monopoly and minimize the mandatory charges that customers have to pay. And perhaps most importantly, continue to have that great big old welcome mat for new technologies and new business models. So I guess I have to put in there one last thing. Slide 5 has nothing to do with my testimony today, but it's just an opportunity, since y'all care about this stuff and care about energy, to look at what's for me been the most impactful chart I've looked at in my entire career, and that is the energy sources and uses for the entire United States, not just the power industry, but everything. And I'll just point out one thing in the red arrow in the upper right-hand box is rejected energy. Of all the quadrillion British thermal units of power that we use, everything from solar down to petroleum on the left hand, rejected energy is well over half. And that means that's heat, friction, other losses, power use that we don't get as a customer at the end of the day. So when people talk to you about energy efficiency, it's not just putting foam in your roof in your attic to keep the heat out of your house in the middle of the summer. It's all the inefficiencies that happen in our transformation of power from its original source to something we can use. So I'll leave you at that, and I want to just say, as one who's kind of been here through the multiple revolutions, you're only as good as what comes after you. And I want to thank the people who came after us at the commission, at ERCOT, at the legislature, and certainly with Governor Perry and Governor Abbott just picking up the baton beautifully from Governor Bush, having a beautiful, consistent, pro-customer philosophy and carrying it forward to the market. On behalf of those of us who got to sit here and testify on these things 25 years ago, thank you for keeping the faith.
Any questions for Mr. Wood? I see none. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.